As we saw at the end of the last lecture, the biggest problem for paternalism comes from its conflict with the respect for autonomy which the presumption of liberty requires us to have. So that means we need to have a sense of what autonomy is. Now, the first thing to distinguish is the difference between autonomy and liberty. We've talked before about liberty, but it's good here to get a good sense of what it is because it's going to be pretty important and pretty difficult to separate the two in a very clean way. So take a minute and write down some example cases in which a person has liberty and some cases in which a person doesn't. And then just take a shot at giving kind of a definition of what liberty is. And when you're done, you can look at the picture of the cat, which has absolutely nothing to do with the slide, and then we can continue. Your definition of liberty probably had something to do with people being free to choose things, or with them being free to act. And so I think it's useful if we just use liberty and free choice or free action interchangeably. We can expand the notion of being free to choose and act on the choices that you make by saying that a choice or an action is free when a person could have done something else or they could have done nothing at all. Given this definition, take a minute, pause, and think about the following cases and whether or not a person has or whether they lack liberty in them. So the cases are somebody sleepwalking, somebody being pushed or tripping or falling, somebody stopping at a stop sign to avoid a ticket, and a person responding to the robber's demand to give her your money or your life. So sleepwalkers can move around wherever they want. So it's not as though the restriction is like if somebody was tied up in a box. But that doesn't mean that they have liberty. Because a person who's sleepwalking doesn't choose what to do, and or at least they don't choose in anything like the conscious way in which we make our choices in everyday life. And so therefore sleepwalkers don't have liberty. And the same would be true if some evil scientist attached like a remote control to your brain so that they could operate your body and move it around like a puppet, and however they chose. That would be the equivalent, I think, of the sleepwalker case. So one wouldn't have liberty then either. Obviously, you have no liberty when you're falling. You're under the control of gravity, and no choice you make will change that. But when you stop at a stop sign, your liberty is not violated by the fact that the law requires you to stop. And this is because it's possible for you to continue through without stopping. It's not like your inability to stop when you're falling off of a cliff. That brings us to the really hard and interesting case. Are you acting freely if somebody points a gun at you and says your money or your life? That's what I want to talk about now. Because when we start thinking about the case of the robber, we can see that liberty is not all there is to autonomy. Okay, so here's a bit of a warning. I'm now going to take you on a pretty long trip to make what's a rather simple point. What we care about when we're talking about respecting people's freedom and making sure that they're able to pursue their own lives isn't just being concerned with their ability to make free choices and act freely. Rather, what we care about is that people can act on desires which are genuinely theirs. And by that, I mean these are desires that are autonomous. Now, the reason for the long trip we're about to take isn't to torture you. I promise. I wouldn't do such a thing. There's at least four reasons why I think it's useful for us to take it. So first, the distinction between autonomy and liberty can get kind of slippery at places and hard to grasp. And well, things that are slippery tend to get messed up on exams. And so I want you to have as firm a grip on the difference between the two and why the difference is actually important. Second, I suspect that some of you in class will want to argue that what we actually care about is just liberty and not autonomy. And that's a position, there's a lot to be said for it. So I hope we'll be able to argue over it in class, and thus it's really important that you be able to see what the argument for the position you oppose is, so that you can come, with ammunition to attack it. Third, the discussions as we go, will bring out some of the key features of autonomy. And so for a lot of people, it's kind of easier to see how things fit together when they come out throughout the process. So hopefully this will make it easier to see how they fit together. And fourth, I just hope this will kind of give you a sense of why the thing is important. That said, here we go. To start off and figure out what's going on here, imagine two cases. So in the first, Scarlett gives Violet $100 as a gift. In the second, she gives Violet $100 so that she won't be killed. Now, given our definition of liberty and free action so far, think about in which of these cases Scarlett acts freely. So in the first case, which I'll just call gift, it's pretty obvious that Scarlett has liberty. She freely gives Violet the money. And the action is free because she could have refused to give Violet the money. I mean, it's not as if she was like sleepwalking and just randomly handed $100 to the first person that she met. So in this case, she's definitely free. She definitely has. In theft, Scarlett freely gives Violet the money too. And that's because she still could have refused to give Violet the money. She could have chosen to be killed rather than give up the money. And the mere fact that she could have chosen that way, that's enough for our concept of liberty and free action. So in both cases, Scarlett is freely giving Violet the money. In both cases, she could have refused to give Violet the money, and our condition for whether a choice or an action was free was, whether it was possible for the person to have, not done the action. And in both cases, clearly it was. But obviously, there seems like there should be a big difference between the two. I mean, it doesn't seem like we should say that she was free in exactly the same way in both cases. So that's where that's what we now want to figure out, is what exactly is the difference. You're probably thinking that the difference has something to do with the fact that in the first case, Scarlett wanted to give Violet the money, but in the second case, she was forced to do it. It was Violet's threat that made her do it. So the difference is supposed to be something with the idea of somebody making somebody else do something or forcing someone to do it. But now we need to know a better sense, like what does it actually mean to say that Scarlett was made to do something? Well, one way of explaining what the difference is in that, what it means for somebody to be made to do something is to say that, well, she was being made to do something that she didn't want to do. That is, in the case gift, Scarlett wanted to give Violet the money, but in theft, Scarlett didn't want to give Violet the money. But there's at least one sense in which Scarlett did in fact want to give Violet the money. Scarlett wanted to stay alive, and $100 was the price of not being killed. So it seems like Scarlett did want to give Violet the money. So this is a problem for the claim that the difference between the two cases is the fact that in one, Scarlett didn't want to do what she did, and the other she didn't want to do it. So to see how there's a problem here, we can compare a new case, we can compare a new case, and let's call it pizza, to the case of theft. So in the case of pizza, Scarlett gives Indigo $15 for a pizza. Of course, Scarlett would prefer it if Indigo gave her the pizza for free, but Indigo is not going to give her free pizza. But since Indigo won't give her free pizza, it still seems reasonable to say that Scarlett wanted to give Indigo $15. So now let's look at how the case of theft and pizza compare. So in theft, $100 was the price of not getting shot. And obviously, Scarlett would prefer it if she didn't have to pay anything to avoid getting shot. But just like Indigo was unwilling to give Scarlett free pizza, Violet is unwilling to let Scarlett stay alive for free. So therefore, if we're willing to say that Scarlett wanted to give Indigo $15 in pizza, then we should say that Scarlett wanted to give Violet $100 in theft. Now, the model penal code definition of the crime of larceny, which is what most people are talking about when they talk about theft, implies that a person can't commit theft if the victim gives them the property consensually, and that's except where fraud is involved. And it seems like that if you want to give somebody something, then you consent to their taking it. And we just showed that Scarlett wanted to give Violet $100. That was the point of the comparison to pizza. So if we agree that to the principle, if A wants to give B X, then A consents to B taking X, and we agree that Scarlett wanted to give Violet $100, and we accept that if A consents to give X to B, then B did not steal X from A, well, we just showed that Scarlett consented to give Violet the money because she wants to do it, in just the same way that she wants to give Indigo the money in pizza. And so therefore, it turns out that in the case theft, Violet did not actually commit theft. So this is obviously the wrong answer, and we need some way of fixing it up to figure out what actually is the difference between the case of theft and the case of gift. So we should get rid of the idea that the difference is, in one case the person wants to do something, and in the other case the person doesn't want to do something. And we might instead think that the relevant difference is that in one case somebody is being made to do something that they don't want to do. Um, so what we need then to do is um, find some other way of articulating the difference between pizza and theft. And another possibility is that in pizza, Scarlett was giving the Indigo the money in order to get something that she wanted. But in theft, Scarlett was giving Violet the money to avoid getting something she didn't want, namely shot. So maybe we can't infer that somebody wanted to pay when they're only paying to avoid something. So in the case of pizza, we can infer from the fact that Scarlett pays the money for the pizza. We can infer from that she wants the pizza because she's doing it to get something she wants. But in the case of theft, we can't infer that she wants to pay to give Violet the $100 because what she's trying to do is avoid getting something through making the payment. Now, that would avoid the problem we face. This would block the argument that showed that Violet didn't actually commit theft because it would deny that Scarlett wanted to give Violet $100. So now we need to test out the idea that the relevant difference is between, wanting to paying the money to get something you want and paying money to avoid something that you don't want. So here's a new case to consider. In Ticket, Scarlett stops at a stop sign because she doesn't want to have to pay a $100 ticket if she gets caught. So in both cases, Scarlett is doing the action in order to avoid something, in order to avoid getting something. And that means that the relevant difference between the cases can't be that in some the person wants to have something, and in the other cases the person does the thing to avoid getting something that they don't want. So we need to think up something else that can give us the difference between our original two cases, theft and gift, that can explain why it seems different, that why we want to say that the person doesn't seem free in one, but seems free in the other. And you probably figured out a long time ago that the difference isn't the content of what the person wants. The difference is in the way that the person wants it, something like that, right? What we want to say is that it's true Scarlett wanted to give Violet the money in the case of theft, but she didn't really want to give her the money. And somehow the key idea here is the idea of a person really wanting something rather than, just wanting something in general. And the idea of somebody really wanting something versus just, wanting in general, that lets us differentiate out all our cases. Because in the case of gift, Scarlett really wanted to give Violet $100. In pizza, she really wanted to give Indigo $15. And in Ticket, Scarlett really wanted to avoid paying $100. But in the case of theft, Scarlett didn't really want to give Violet $100. Now, obviously, the sense of really want, right here, doesn't mean that Scarlett is like super excited about it or that she'll get a lot of joy from, getting what she really wants. Because, well, as we saw in the case of pizza, what she really wants, in the sense of wants most, is to get the pizza for free. So the idea of really want isn't the idea of, wanting of something that you want the most. Instead, it's the idea that it's something that you genuinely want. When we're talking about the idea of somebody really wanting something, or genuinely wanting something, um, people often say things like, well, the desire is like yours, and it's a desire that you kind of had on your own, and that no one else is forced upon you. No one else has kind of imposed it upon you. It's really your desire. It's something that you yourself as an individual want. So we can now end our little trip. I bet you had fun. And give these desires, the idea of things that a person really wants, we can give them a new name. We can just say that these are the desires that are autonomous. And now we can explain what the difference between theft and gift was. It's not in the that a person has liberty in one case but not in the other. It's that in one case, Scarlett didn't really want to give Violet $100. And since really wanting is the idea of autonomously desiring something, then we say that the desire Scarlett had to give Violet the money when she was being robbed wasn't a desire that she autonomously had. And so the difference between the two cases is that in the case of the gift, the desire to give over the money was autonomous, but in the case of theft, the desire to give over the money was non-autonomous. And that's the explanation of the difference that we've been looking for. So we can summarize now the relationship between liberty and autonomy by saying that liberty is a necessary but not sufficient condition of autonomy. And one reason for this, and the reason we've been mainly talking about, is that coercion, which is somebody forcing you to do something, is compatible with liberty. It's not compatible with autonomy. And the whole concept of coercion and threat and things like that are really central to the notion of autonomy. Because when we ask whether or not a person's choice was autonomous, we're not just asking whether or not she could have done something else, or whether she could have failed to do it. So we're not asking like the equivalent of like, well, was she sleepwalking, or was she a robot? What we're asking is whether what she did was something that she really wanted to do, or that it's kind of a choice that she made that reflects what her actual choices, her actual preferences and desires are. It's a choice that nobody else made for her. It's a choice that was hers and hers alone. So the word autonomy is reflects this. That's the concept I think that's at issue here, because the word autonomy, it comes from Greek, and auto means self, and nomos means a like a law, or to rule over something. And so the idea is that an autonomous person is someone who rules over herself, who gives the law to herself. And there are other slogans that get used here. Some of them are a little nicer than being the ruler of yourself. So one I kind of like is being the author of your own life. Being the person that kind of is in charge of writing the story of how your life goes. And another one is, the metaphor is to think of your life as like a ship, sailing along, and you're the captain. You're in charge of where it goes. You plot your own course and your own destiny. And that's the idea that's behind the concept of autonomy. Now, there are at least two kinds of autonomy that people talk about, and I'm just going to mention the first so we can set it aside, and so, if you're looking online for stuff, you won't get kind of confused by some of the things people talk about. So the first concept is the idea of moral autonomy. And this has to do with stuff about the idea of free will, and the idea that autonomous action is the morally correct action. So this is the stuff that gets associated with Kant a lot, and we're not going to talk about this at all. So instead, we're going to focus on what gets called personal autonomy, and that's the concept that we've brought out through my little story. Now, just to keep things neat, it's worth pointing out that there's two different things we can apply the adjective autonomous to. So we can talk about a person being autonomous, or we can talk about an action being autonomous. And this distinction actually matters in some places, and you get different answers depending on your theory about kind of how you stick the two together. But for our purposes, we're just going to understand an autonomous person to be the sort of person who normally acts in autonomous ways. That means that being an autonomous person is like being a friendly person. Um, Friendly people are people who are generally friendly, but they don't have to be friendly at all times to count as friendly. You can have a bad day if you're a friendly person, but still, it has to be a pretty stable personality trait before we call someone friendly. It's not like someone who's like friendly one day and like super antisocial the next day and just like flips back and forth all the time. We wouldn't call the person friendly because that's not a stable thing. It has to be um, kind of a more persistent thing that lasts over time. And so, that means that we can just say that an autonomous person is someone whose actions are, generally autonomous. Okay, so we've seen that autonomy requires that a person's able to make free choices, that they have liberty. But we've also seen that we need to add something else to free actions in order to get autonomous actions. So the different theories are going to give you a different answer as to what the something else is. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. All right, so there's a whole bunch of different conceptions of autonomy. Um, and these are just a selection. There's formal theories, substantive theories, hybrid theories, which try to combine formal and substantive theories, and maybe some of the other ones. Reason-centered theories, which define autonomy in terms of kind of your rational capacities. There's control-centered autonomy theories, which my own view actually falls into the category of, where the idea is that there's this kind of conception of self-control that's fundamental to our idea of what it is to be autonomous. There's what we might call choice-centered theories, where a person's sort of ability to make certain kinds of choices and her development of her capacities to make those choices, those are the things that we've got to add to liberty in order to get autonomy. And then the last one are sort of intersectional theories of autonomy, which are a bit harder to describe kind of in this framework because they generally come out of a feminist tradition of thinking about autonomy, which points out that all this concept of autonomy we've been talking about so far kind of assumes that like individuals are like distinct, separate people. Or like every man is an island, right? That's the Thomas More picture, where each of us are completely individual and separate with our own interests and our own desires. And so the idea is that you're not autonomous if somebody else forces their desires upon you. And the feminist picture, or a feminist picture, there's lots of them, a feminist picture, which I like quite a lot, is that that's a mistake when it comes to certain kinds of relationships, at least. Because when you're in a really close and tight relationship, or friendship, or families, it's kind of like your best friend's desires. Some of theirs are just kind of the same as yours. It's like if your friend asks you, your best friend like asks you for a ride to the airport. It's in a sense almost the same as if you yourself wanted to go to the airport. There's just kind of like there's no space. If your mom asks you to do something, and you love your mom and all that, then it's kind of like you yourself wanting to do it. So on those theories are a bit hard to slot in because they kind of reject one of the basic premises that we've been assuming in our discussion here. And I would love to talk about these more in class, so I hope somebody will bring them up. But just for this lecture, we're going to focus on two conceptions of autonomy. Again, I would be very happy to talk about any of the other ones in class, but the ones we're going to focus on are the formal theories and the substantive theories. So really roughly, a substantive theory gives you a list of things that a person needs to have in order to be autonomous. So they're like lists of things that people that you have to want, or in some cases certain capacities that you have, certain like abilities and whatnot. So uh, you might say, for example, that an autonomous person has to have a desire for desires for her own future welfare, right? She has to want that her kind of future goes well. And so that means that she'll make decisions which reflect her concern about um, how things that she does now are going to affect the future. And she also has to have capacities like a certain amount of rationality and a certain amount of reflective self-knowledge and things like that. Whereas on a formal theory, a formal theorist doesn't say what desires you have to have or what capacities you have to have. They just say that, whatever desires you have, they have the right structure. So where, the idea is substantive theory says there's a substance that you have to have. Whereas a formal theory says, it's just the format, right? It's open what you can actually fill in the blanks with. It's just that the desires have to have a certain structure. Like for example, they can't be in conflict. You can't have inconsistent desires. You can't want to have pizza and not want to have pizza, and both of those desires be equally strong. That would be the sort of that would potentially fail to be autonomous. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit more about substantive theories first. And these are theories which are going to tell you that you have to have a certain set of desires and abilities in order to be autonomous. So this is a good spot to pause and write down some examples of desires that you might think a person has to have in order to be autonomous. So here's one example of a substantive theorist, and that's Joel Feinberg, who we've been talking about before. He says that the kernel of the idea of autonomy is that it involves the right to make choices and actions. So then he gives us a list of things that a person has to be concerned with in order to be autonomous. So he says that a person is autonomous only if she's concerned with things like, what sort of things can go into their body, like so concerned about deciding what kinds of foods or other substance to consume, how one will allow other people to come in contact with oneself. So, a person would violate your autonomy if they, stand against you and press you up against a wall, if you don't want them doing it. You have to be able to be free, to move around. If somebody sticks you in a box, then you are not going to be autonomous. So you have to have the freedom to move around and some sort of concern about being free to move around. And then the same applies to being able to use some of your chattels, which just means physical property that you can move around. And what information you disclose to others and what information you conceal. So these are things that you have to both have some sort of make decisions about and care enough about them to make decisions about. And B, they have to be protected from other people messing with them, because when somebody else messes with them, they damage your autonomy. And that means that a person who didn't have any concern with, what sort of substances went into their body, right? Somebody walks by and paints them with oil or some cancer-causing chemical, and they don't care, or you could give them rotten food or whatever. They don't care. They'll just put it in their mouth. That sort of person who didn't have any preferences whatsoever wouldn't be autonomous. And the same thing applies to, someone who just is content to be, pushed around or confined into a box or whatever, without any say-so in it. That person wouldn't be autonomous either. Now, there's actually a trick here, which maybe you spotted. A person who cares about, so take the example of, food, right? Where or what goes into one's body, um, you could potentially have the right sort of concern and just decide that, well, I don't care, I'm not going to worry about it. So that's being concerned about it. It's just the decision is to not actually kind of put any restrictions on it, but you've still made a decision about what restrictions to have, namely none. So now we can look at some examples of formal theories of autonomy. Now, like I said, on a formal theory of autonomy, they don't say you have to care about anything. They don't say anything about you needing to, for example, have a concern with your future well-being or anything like that. All they say is that your desires have to have a certain kind of structure. So one of the basic things that usually a substantive theorist is going to require is that your desires be consistent. So you want what you want. It doesn't matter what you want. It just matters that you can't have like desires that are contradictory, that have exactly the same how should I say, like force, right? Because obviously, like you want pizza, but you don't want to be fat, and so from the second one, it follows that you don't want pizza. But, if you want one more than the other, you really are hungry and you don't care that much about, potentially gaining weight, or you can know that you can go to the gym later, your desires don't conflict in the relevant way, because though they, kind of are opposite, one gets a higher ranking than the other. So there's not a conflict. The conflict is when two desires have exactly the same strength, but are in exact opposition. So that's a really simple picture, and that's actually not the sort of more sophisticated account that you're going to get from someone like Frankfurt. Because the idea for Frankfurt is that it's not just that you have your desires be consistent, but it's that you have desires that are consistent with what you want yourself to want. So it's what we call a second. It involves things like second order desires. You have to not just want. So say you are making a decision about whether to have pizza, right? And we want to know whether your decision to have pizza is autonomous. Well, the question is whether or not you not just want the pizza, but whether you want to want the pizza. That means that you kind of have to have this second order reflection upon what you want. And in fact, it's even more complicated than that. And I'm not going to say too much here. Say a little bit more later. It's a little more complicated because he actually says your desire for the pizza has to be something that you want to be your will. So it's not just something that you want, but it's something that you want to be the desire that actually guides your choices. And so that's what I mean here by something like identification. That you have to see the desires upon which you act as genuinely your desires. Whereas other desires that you might have just kind of flip in and out and aren't desires that you identify with. They're not desires you want to have, or you want to have. Okay. And I'll give you an example. So the last line, dishes versus OCD. These are what I like to call interlopers. So here's an example I use. Right? Suppose you're like doing dishes. You've got the garbage disposal ready. And you just have this sudden completely out of the blue to stick your hand in the garbage disposal. Now you have it's an urge, right? And there's no way in the world you're going to do it because you like your hand. You don't want to you don't want to injure yourself. And the urge goes away like as soon as you kind of recognize, you go, huh? Why did I want it? But it goes away, right? Well, that's the kind of thing that it's a desire you have, but it's not a desire that you want to have, and it's definitely not a desire that you want to be the one that you act on. It's an interloper. It just pops in, says hello, and then takes off. And you can think of this, and this may happen more. Uh, it can be, in the case like just random urges like that. That's just normal part of human life. But it can have an evil side to it too, right? So you think about what's, kind of particularly nasty about something like obsessive compulsive disorder. And it's one thing if you're just obsessive, but you like your obsessions. Like, I personally wish I was more obsessive and like, more of a neat freak, right? I think that would solve a lot of problems, right? Um, but somebody who's, has a pathological kind of obsessiveness where, they can't leave the house without touching every appliance 6 times. You know, the desire to touch the appliances 6 times isn't a desire that they want to have, and it's definitely not a desire that they want to be the one they act on. And that's why it can be so like maddening. It feels like, there's this desire that you have to do something, you have to act on it, but you can't stop yourself from doing it. It's not really you. You don't really want to be, touching all the appliances. You don't want to have your life kind of ruled by these desires. And so the reason why those are so bad and why they're the enemy of autonomy is because they're desires that don't feel like they're yours. They're desires that when you think about them, you don't think of as yours. You think of them as though somebody else has put them in your head, where they come from somewhere else. They invade you. And they are the desires that when you have them and when you act on them, those are the desires that are non-autonomous and sort of non-autonomous in the worst possible way. And I'm going on about this a lot because I hope you can see that this is going to this is going to lead straight up into addiction. Because you might think that the danger addiction poses to autonomy is that it makes you have desires for stuff that you don't want to have. But yet those desires are things that make you do stuff. And, it's a particularly terrible thing to be made to do something by a desire that you don't even feel like is yours. So that's the way. So that I hope you can see there's like a big door here in this kind of concept of autonomy for the problems that surround addiction to come walking right in. And we're going to talk a lot about that later. And so in addition, so you can see then, how the very sort of straightforward cases for a formal theorist, straightforward cases of non-autonomous acts come about. One is where your desires are not consistent. And another is just where you do stuff that's inconsistent with what your acts are, right? So suppose you say that what you really want is to get an A on your exam, and you believe that you really want to get an A on your exam. But when your friend calls the night before the exam and says, "Hey, want to go to the bar?" You're like, "I really should stay in and go to the, because I want to get an A on my exam." And they're like, "Come on." And you're like, "Okay." And you run off to the bar. Well, it seems like two things are possible. One is you were just wrong. You don't really want to get an A on the exam. You want to go drinking. But the other is that no, actually what you want most is to get an A on the exam. But somehow the other desire, the desire to go drinking, that guides your action, kind of overrides it. And you can see from what I said before, if the overriding desire is a desire that you don't want to be overriding, then you've got a serious problem for autonomy there. So this sets us up now for being able to talk about how addiction might pose a very special danger to autonomy.